Hello and good evening, and welcome to Wildlife from the Wildlife Trusts for April 2025. And I'm delighted to be able to tell you that tonight we're covering a topic that's certainly very dear to my heart, and I know many of you are very interested. We're asking the question, ecocide, should destroying nature be a crime? And my goodness, we put together a fantastic panel to be able to help us through this discussion tonight. We have Jojo Mehta, who's of course the chair of Stop Ecocide Foundation. We could not be doing this if we did not have the wonderful Stop Ecocide International with us tonight to be able to talk about this topic. I'm delighted also that we have Yuliia Ovchynnykova, who's a member of Parliament and with the Ukrainian Parliament, and also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly for the Council of Europe. And it will become clear why we particularly wanted someone from Ukraine to be talking and joining this conversation tonight. We have the legend, can I say, that is Jonathon Porritt, sustainability, he's looking troubled at me saying that, sustainability campaigner and author. Delighted that Jonathon can join us tonight. And of course, to bring us back down to the local, we have the wonderful Tann, Chief Executive of Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. So why did we want to look at this topic tonight? It is a concept that's been growing in recent years, thanks to the wonderful people that came up with the idea in the first place. We'll hear a bit from Jojo about that in a moment. And it's really gaining momentum here in the UK and around the world, as you're here tonight. And it seems right to be asking ourselves the question, has the time come to consider how we can establish ecocide as a crime in law, perhaps internationally, but also perhaps one day here in the UK. And there's been a lot of interest from you tonight about this. We've had over 200 questions submitted before we even start tonight. So please do feel free to keep adding your questions and comments in the chat. We'll try and get through as many as we possibly can. Just keep it friendly, please. It's a huge topic to cover. So what is ecocide? Well, we'll hear a bit more in terms of the sort of formal definitions from Jojo in a minute. But ecocide is the extensive destruction of ecosystems caused by human activity, leading to significant harm to the environment and wildlife. Is it time to make the destruction of nature a criminal act? Now, of course, you have specific laws about harming particular species or causing particular pollution and all kinds of regulations in relation to that. But this is the concept of a much more general crime to be able to capture that kind of more widespread destruction of ecosystems. And tonight, this panel will help us explore the ethical, legal, and environmental implications of criminalising ecocide and examining how international law can evolve to deal with these topics. So Jojo, I'm going to come to you first of all. First of all, tell us a little bit about Stop Ecocide International, how it was formed, and actually where the concept of ecocide came from, because it is a lovely story. And what is it?
Thank you. Great to be here, Craig, and a pleasure to be in this amazing company. Well, the term ecocide is actually over 50 years old. It was first coined to describe the awful damage caused by Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, the defoliant, and the awful effects of that. It was first used on the diplomatic stage in 1972 at the very first UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm. But its journey since then has mostly not been in public view. There have been some legal developments at different points. There was a convention drafted in 1974, and then the conversation sort of resurfaced at one or two points, in particular in the 1990s, when the International Law Commission was drafting a code of crimes against the peace and security of mankind. And at that time, there was a clause that was being drafted that would have covered severe, widespread and long-term harm to the environment. Now, that clause was dropped. It was dropped without a vote. We don't quite know why, but we do know that there were certain countries that intervened and they didn't approve of that clause. One was, in fact, the UK. Another was the US, and then there was also France and the Netherlands, and at one point, Brazil. Now, it's interesting to note that those are all oil countries. And also at that time, several of those were also engaged in exploring, if not already engaged in, nuclear testing. So you can sort of see we can hypothesize, with some potential accuracy as to why that might have happened. But that discussion, if you like, led into the discussions that became the negotiations for the Rome Statute, for the treaty that was signed in 1998 and brought into existence the International Criminal Court. However, when that came into play in 1998, and when the court opened its doors in 2002, there were only 3 international crimes that were listed: war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. And the crime of aggression was added later, but ecocide was not among them. And actually, it's worth pausing for a moment to think about what world we might be in today had ecocide been made an international crime 20-something years ago. And this was indeed the same question, if you like, that crossed the mind of pioneering barrister Polly Higgins, with whom I co-founded what is now Stop Ecocide International. And when she discovered, as she did by engaging in some research in the sort of UN archives in Geneva, when she discovered that this clause had been dropped from those earlier draftings, she actually ended up really dedicating the last 10 years of her life towards what she saw as restoring the missing international crime. Now, I met Polly in 2014 when I was very involved in on-the-ground environmental activism in the UK. I was very involved in the anti-fracking movement. That's how we met. And we started working together almost immediately. But at that time, it was difficult to get support for what she was doing. It was still considered quite extreme to criminalize harm to nature. It wasn't considered something that felt intuitive to people. That's changed an awful lot since then. And I worked with Polly for 4.5 years. She is sadly no longer with us. She died of cancer in 2019, 2 years after we started what is now Stop Ecocide International. And I suppose the key activity, really, in fact, is the kind of unique focus of our organisation globally, and we've grown now to become an international NGO with representation in over 40 countries, is really this singular thing to criminalise the worst harms to nature, to name them as serious crimes. And we do that on 2 levels. We work at the diplomatic and political level, sort of advancing the conversation and supporting that conversation with legislators, but we also work at the sort of public level in terms of cultivating the conversation and creating a really strong and very, very cross-sector discussion around the globe in many, many different sectors about ecocide law.
Jojo, that's really, really useful. So then tell us then, how do you define ecocide? What makes to your mind something particular crime of ecocide? And there's a few hints, aren't there, in some of the very specific words I used in my introduction.
Yes, indeed. And the definition is incredibly important because it's actually been probably the biggest milestone in how fast this discussion has been developing at the global legislative level and also in a very cross-sector way. The definition that is being used internationally is one that emerged from a drafting process in 2021 that was convened by our charitable foundation and involved 12 top lawyers from around the world. Now, Polly had a definition of ecocide. Others in the past had definitions of ecocide. But it's one thing for a lawyer to decide it should look a certain way and another to have the level of gravitas and credibility that will have governments pay attention and look to legislating. And so when we were approached by politicians in 2020 from Sweden, as it happens, asking us to convene an international panel to bring out a consensus definition of ecocide, this was an amazing opportunity. And 12 lawyers worked on this for 6 months. And what they came up with was launched in the summer of 2021, totally transformed the conversation internationally. And within a year became the de facto starting point for legal, political and academic discussions. And it's so simple and concise, the operative part, that with your permission, I'll actually read it now. So it fits on the back of a business card, which is actually very useful when you're dealing with busy politicians who don't have time to read through a 20-page report. So in brief and in very concise terms, ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So that's actually a very simple definition, but deceptively so, in the sense that if you're a lawyer in that area, you will recognize that legal language. It is drawn from previous treaties and conventions, the Geneva Protocols, the Environmental Modification Convention, and other parts of the Rome Statute. But it's also very straightforward to understand for you or I. And that's obviously hugely helpful. But I think there are also a couple of aspects to it that are very important. As we all know, there's plenty of environmental law in play around the world, and most of it is very detailed and prescriptive and involves lots of very specific do's and don'ts, certain acts that are prohibited or certain limits to the use of certain toxins, all of those kinds of things. And what actually often can happen, particularly in the territory of transnational corporations that can well afford it, is that system can be gamed. If there's an activity that's prohibited, well, let's make sure that what we're doing is in a slightly different category, and therefore, we can carry on with it. Or, if there's a limit to how much of a toxin we can use, we will stay at that limit all the time. And if we go over it, well, we might have to chuck out a bid in compensation, but it won't in any way compete with the profits. Those kinds of attitudes, if you like. What you have with a definition like this is very different, because it's actually more like what we intuitively understand in criminal law as a consequence-based definition. I mean, as a simple example, if you murder someone, it's not how you do it that criminalizes you. It's the fact that the person ends up dead. And this definition works in a similar way. It's not about what you do, it's about how bad are the consequences. And that is super important, because it means that it's not restricted to certain sectors or certain activities. It actually provokes those real world questions of what are we doing? Is it creating that level of harm? And in which case, what do we need to do something about it? So it has a very kind of powerful and future-proof, if you like, effect, and one that lands well in the political world, not least because it doesn't demonize any one particular activity, but instead looks to the safety factor.
So let's get into that a little bit, Jojo, because this is important at the very start of this Wild Live. There's specific words, aren't there, in that definition that are really important. So first of all, it means unlawful or wanton acts. So unlawful we can get our head around. Wanton means what? Deliberate, in other words, essentially.
It actually refers to what we would term in English as recklessness.
Right. Yeah.
So effectively, I mean, the way international law works, and this was drafted as an international crime, although in fact it has inspired proposals of law in many national jurisdictions as well already. International crimes don't tend to invent new criminal activity. They tend to sort of enhance existing prohibitions and raise them to a level of international law. So that's part of the reason for having, the fact that an act, if it's already unlawful, but it's creating this, additional, particular level of harm, then it's raised to a level of a very serious crime. With the wanton, what you're looking at is actually an interesting exercise for lawyers, which was the bringing together of criminal law and environmental law. Now, environmental law, particularly at the international level, has very few outright prohibitions. It's based on a kind of balancing act that focuses around sustainable development. So making that sort of match, if you like, with criminal law, which needs a certain clarity, is quite an interesting exercise. And what the lawyers came up with was actually a kind of balancing act where even if what you're doing has been permitted, if the level of harm it creates is disproportionate, in other words, it's in excess of anything that should be justified by your original social and economic intentions, then that too could be ecocide. And that's actually quite important, because it means that, for example, where I don't know, the permit for something was fraudulently obtained, or where the damage that's created, it may create a profit for somebody, but it may actually decimate local communities and ecosystems, and in that case, you're also looking at a potential ecocide. So it's that's the kind of thinking behind that threshold.
And so you've also got the definition. This is got to be committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of this harm. So committed with knowledge is important. that doesn't rule out recklessness, does it? Because you can be reckless, you should know something, but you can still recklessly do it.
Exactly. It's actually a way of defining recklessness, in fact. In
Right.
other words, that you knew or should have known
Yeah,
that that there were particular consequences to decisions that you're making. And so effectively and if you take that decision anyway, then you're committing with knowledge effectively.
absolutely.
You can't work with Ecocide, you can't work with direct intentionality,
Yeah,
because most ecocides actually, I mean, obviously there's a difference in the context of conflict, which Yuliia can elaborate on more. But during peacetime, most ecocide is not deliberate in the sense of, you don't set out to destroy an ecosystem. You're probably setting out to carry out your business activity that's going to make you your profit or whatever it is you're going to do. But this is a very severe collateral effect, if you like. So it's very important that it is not direct intention only, otherwise it won't be very usable.
sure. And then also there's a definition in the definition, it talks about it being widespread or long-term damage. Now, this is very important, isn't it? It's because actually, actually might rule out some things that people would really wish were counted as ecocide. And it's interesting to note, like today, there's been a news story. I don't know if you've seen it, but the felling of a really old ancient oak in London by actually a Toby Carvery next to one of their restaurants. I mean, it's a heartbreaking story. It's been called London's Sycamore Gap story. The felling of this beautiful old ancient tree. But in all likelihood, and some people have said on social media this afternoon, is this ecocide? This count as ecocide? In all likelihood, the felling of a single tree, no matter how beautiful, that's unlikely to count, isn't it? Under this definition.
Generally speaking, yes, it's unlikely to count. I mean, there is one aspect to the definition that does include significant cultural harm that
Right.
results
Yeah.
from environmental damage. Whether that would cover something like this is something that would have to be worked out in court, one assumes.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
generally speaking, no, we're not talking about sort of chopping down the trees on the village green. I mean, if it's going to be an international level crime, it has to be serious. And it's actually quite important that it is fairly narrow, because what it needs to do is name the worst harms as very serious. Because what that does is creates a kind of a foundational rule that then supports the existing edifice of environmental law without kind of treading on it, but it gives it support. So, a board of directors, for example, is going to think very differently about ticking the environmental boxes it should be ticking if they know that if they fail to do so and create severe harm as a result, then actually they could get a tap on the shoulder for personal criminal liability. And that is a totally different level of deterrence from anything that can result from, a breach of regulation. That doesn't tend to carry a moral stigma, whereas criminal law can do that. And it also it taps into that sort of moral sense, if you like. And it also, of course, has an effect on someone's personal reputation, but also a corporate reputation, and hence stock value, for example. So there's a really powerful level of deterrence in putting this in place.
Right, Jojo, brilliant. Thank you. Well, I mean, that's been a very, very useful introduction, and I'm sure you'll get many, many questions in the Q&A coming to you. But let's move on now to Yuliia, who, as I said before, is a member of Parliament in Ukraine. And Yuliia, thank you so much for joining us from Kyiv tonight. Why don't you just tell us your story in relation to Ecocide, both your sort of personal story and of course, the story of Ukraine with relation to this?
Thank you, Craig, very much. Dear colleague, I'm very happy to be here. And first of all, I want to thank you very much for comprehensive and incredible support of our country. So my previous work, I'm from east part of Ukraine. In my previous work, I was the dean of the first displaced university, which relocated from east part when war started 11 years ago to the central part of Ukraine. And we start teach our students in the first relocated university I'm environmentalist, and for me very important to say you about the our story, and for us very important to work to tell the truth. We're unique country because we developing strategy of plans for post-recovery period. We in EU negotiation process, and we still in war. Really, it's very difficult because every day the bombing, and we try to think about the future. But we are very happy that we have special instruments in our legislative sphere for me, this topic is very important. We try to do all the best on the legislative level, the national level, and also try do some very important step on international level in cooperation with Council of Europe and in cooperation with the International Parliamentary Alliance for Recognition of Ecocide. And you know that 3 years ago, this started full-scale invasion and aggressor unprecedented brutal environmental crimes and a lot of consequences. And according to the information, according to the ministry, you know that we have the more than 6,000 environmental crimes. And in our legislature, we have the ecocide definition and include to the criminal code of Ukraine. And this is our article is really stay more than 20 years, but now she's very actual for us because we have a lot of cases of environmental crimes and destruction. And really almost a third of country's territory is mined. We have a lot of damages in forest and animals. And you know about the Kakhovka tragedy, what it started. The destruction of Kakhovka power plant, this really has resulted in significant environmental effects causing widespread flooding in the surrounded areas. And for us, it's really very important to continue this work. And I want to say that really we have the law enforcement agencies have been investing 14 criminal proceedings under the article of 441 ecocide. And for us, very important to pay more attention because really we have a lot of problem because when we adopt our legislation according to the EU standards, we also have a lot of changes in our legislation. And one of the most maybe important question, we have the big discussion about this article, but we had decided we stay this article because last year our country ratified the Rome Statute, and we start this I think that's very, very historical step, very important for us, and according to the accountability. And as I say, very important that in 2022, our president of Ukraine introduced the peace formula and include the paragraph 8 addressing the environmental security and recognition of ecocide. This is it's very big signal for all over the world that it's really very important to fix and to register of damages and to work on these issues. And the next, maybe the instrument of realize the point 8 of peace formula is created the higher level, international higher level group, such as document as environmental compact. This is international document which adopted in this higher level working group. More than maybe for 3 months, this is a group created the 50 recommendation, which include the fixed and all damages. Next one, it's accountability and the green reconstruction. This is 3 very important points which necessary to provide on national level in invited the international cooperation. So, and also I want to add that we have really very important step on international arena in the cooperation with the Council of Europe, because in the Council of Europe created the register of damages. The register of damages include the environmental damages as well. And the next, I think that's the next step for to keep this international structure is the active work on the adopt very important resolutions. This is political signals. One of these, the first 2 years ago, initiated the John Howell from UK, the environmental consequences and of war conflict, which have this very powerful message to international recognition of ecocide and include to the Rome Statute as 5th crime. So, and after all, I think after that we have the 3 resolution which includes the recognition of ecocide. And after all, we also hope that the next month will be sign the agreement according to create the international tribunal. But this is international tribunal include the only the crime of aggression. But for us, it's really to continue work on the international recognition ecocide as well.
Wow, goodness. And Yuliia, given everything else, Ukraine's been facing the last few years, have you ever received sort of any pushback on this, any resistance to the work that's needed to take the concept of ecocide forward? People, have you experienced people saying, no, this isn't as important as everything else we should be dealing, or is it seen as sort of something that very much reinforces the overall message?
Yeah, to tell the truth, after the Kakhovka tragedy, as you know, there may be people and volunteers all over the world can help the animals, can help all this. And we include and open the procedure on the Article 441. And this is push a very big discussion on our level. We have a lot of meetings and cooperation with the young people, with the Council of Young Scientists. So we try to involve in this process and young people to help us pay attention more. Because to tell the truth, I'm the parliamentarian, I understand the environmental issues on the politician levels every time is very sensitive topic and have a lot of balanced interest in the parliament as well. And for example, we on Thursday last week adopted the resolution, its opinion of committee in PACE. And we have the really very difficult discussion along the political group. So, and I think in our country, really, we want penetration, and the signals from President of Ukraine help us in these issues very much. And I hope that we have the very fruitful cooperation with the General Prosecutor Office, because we have the really powerful team here. And this cooperation between General Prosecutor Office, cooperation between Parliament, government, and civil society give us hope for the real result, and we give all the best to continue this work. But it's really very difficult because you have the practical experience in these issues. Because on international law, you can we have the International Tribunal on Environmental Issue, but haven't practiced at all over the world. And I think that's a very difficult process, necessary to continue step by step in these issues. But I hope that our parliament also, as very successfully ratified the Rome Statute, would also will be changed domestic legislation according to the EU standards, but stay the article ecocide in our criminal court.
Well, Yuliia, thank you so much for joining us tonight. That's fascinating. I think it's so interesting for us to hear this extra element of the Ukrainian story that perhaps we haven't heard so much about over the last few years, but fascinating to hear it, and delighted that we can give it a bit of profile tonight. So thank you so much. Let me move on to Jonathon now, Jonathon Porritt. Jonathon, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And delighted really that you can join us, because one of the things I'm really hoping you can do is help kind of locate ecocide, that the concept of ecocide, the thinking about and this amazing proposal that's behind ecocide. Where do you kind of place it in the kind of arc, the long arc, if you like, of environmental thinking? Certainly in the modern environmental movement of the last 60, 70 years, as you might call it, but perhaps longer than that as well. Where does it sit for you? And I know you consider it's important. Why do you consider it important?
I think that this question of how ecocide fits now with centuries of different models of progress for humankind is absolutely critical. And that's why I'm so pleased to work with Jojo, with Stop Ecocide International, because I think it is really a crucial campaign for all of us. But you're right, it's not suddenly springing up out of nowhere. It is very much part and parcel of our understanding that centuries of this particular model of progress, which is a kind of extractive, destructive, sacrifice nature to benefit humankind model of progress, has got us to the state that we're in today. And in a way, creating a specific crime of ecocide is one of the most dreadful acknowledgements that we now have to seek a legal redress to stop those people doing what they're doing, which would in effect stop humankind's tenure on this planet. That's literally what we're talking about now. If you look at the combined climate and nature emergencies, we're not talking about, you know, various levels of worsening damage. We're talking about an existential threat to us as a species on the planet. So ecocide stands for this moment of truth where everything that we have done up until now to try and manage, mitigate, temper, control, regulate the process of industrial development that we've had, this juggernaut of development that we've had, particularly since the Second World War in the last century. That's true, but it goes back far further than that. We can talk about that if you want. Everything has failed. I'm sorry, people get really cross with me when I say that, because they say, well, surely not. We've done some amazing things and we've stopped even worse things happening than would have happened otherwise. And that's all true. We've won many battles during the course of this time. But on the whole, we're still losing the war. And actually, Jojo just summed it up really well in terms of explaining the difference between all the laws that we have in place today in all of our countries, whether that's in Ukraine or here in the UK or anywhere, less so in the USA now, as all those laws are being gotten rid of. But in most countries, we still have laws. But of course, those who represent this model of progress have got incredibly good at gaming. I think that was the word Jojo used, at gaming those laws. Now, Ecocide is shifting it up a bit. It's taking the whole story of criminality to that higher philosophical level. And that's why I think it's so important in the great span of environmental endeavors today.
Thank you, Jonathon. We had, I'm going to push you a little bit further, actually, because we had a, mainly because you and I have had a conversation before now, which I'm hoping you might come back to. There was a brilliant question that came in from Rihanna Jones that asked very simply, why do people think it's okay to destroy nature? And I'm sort of also struck by the interesting point that those countries that have, most of those countries that have recognized sort of rights for nature in any sense, I mean, notably Canada, New Zealand, Belize, I think, and so on. I think one thing they've all got in common are sort of indigenous communities, Native Americans, say, Native communities, First Nations in Canada, and so on, that come from a very different historic tradition to, say, the European cultural tradition that ended up seeing nature as quite separate. And I've heard you talk brilliantly on this before. Let me just invite you to give me your sense that to Rihanna's question, that asked that simple question: why do people think it's okay to destroy nature?
Because we've got very used to people, decision makers in politics and business, telling us that it's okay to destroy nature because that's the price we have to pay for progress for our particular species. And so, Craig, you're hinting at the fact that we do need to take this story back further than the middle of the last century, back before the post-Second World War era. We have to go back to the start of the Industrial Revolution, and then you have to go back even further than that, essentially to the record of colonialism and the massive damage done as European powers spread their really phenomenally destructive ecocidal tendencies, behaviors across huge swathes of the world, as we know. And from that point on, the dominant narrative has been that the environment must unfortunately be a victim, a sacrifice to generating the kind of progress that we need. And the last time that we ever had a balance, a codependency, a co-created relationship between humankind and nature was indeed during that pre-colonial era, when huge numbers of people all around the planet lived in that sense of harmony with the natural world. So this goes very deep indeed. And I guess we legitimized the destruction of the environment and nature because we were always told that that's what progress depended on. And without that kind of progress, we wouldn't be able to improve the lot of humankind. We wouldn't be able to improve our material quality of life. We wouldn't be able to address poverty, for heaven's sake, all of these kind of things. And those have become sort of tropes. They become almost the hidden text of what progress looks like today. And politicians don't need to unpack those very often, because they're now very deeply embedded in our collective psyche. So it is really challenging. And just before anyone thinks I'm getting too precious about this, we environmentalists have contributed to all of this. We on many occasions and through many organizations have subscribed to the notion that we can use nature to our own betterment. And we either do that well or we do it badly. But it's a very instrumental, exploitative use of nature. It's on our terms. And whether we get it right or we don't is down to the laws of the countries in which nature is being put in the frame, as it were, as part of the progress story. When I was director of Friends of the Earth, Craig, you'll understand this, first ever rainforest campaign launched here in the UK in 1987. How did we characterize the Brazilian rainforest? A treasure chest, a place where we could go to find benefits for humankind. Yeah, another colleague of ours, Tony Juniper, wrote a really good book, but a book whose title told us pretty much everything you need to know about this. What has nature ever done for us? So we've ended up in this bizarre and really shrunken world of trying to define a business case for nature. And trust me, that's never going to work.
And for you, it really comes back to that, the pre-colonial area, and that extractive model of colonialism really did come from a thinking that considered ourselves as apart from nature, and separate from nature, rather than a part of nature. Yeah. And integral to it. And of course, we're starting to learn again now that everything we hold dear, our lives, our health, our well-being, all life on Earth is, of course, 100% dependent on nature. But we don't. It should be obvious, but we kind of seem to have forgotten that. Yeah,
it should be obvious, and we've not listened to the leaders. Wonderful, inspirational people in the environment movement going back many decades, who base their whole philosophical approach and advocacy around that notion of we are intrinsically of nature. We can never be apart from it. And therefore we are codependent in terms of the way we create any kind of sustainable future for humankind.
Well, Jonathon, thank you very much for giving us that bigger picture location of this Ecocide within all of that. I'm going to come to Debbie Tann in just a moment to particularly kind of place it into UK context. But actually, before that, I just want to go back to Jojo briefly to ask Jojo, can you just give us a little summary of where we are in the kind of the international story now of how some countries are really showing the lead on Ecocide? I mean, Yuliia gave us some wonderful examples to Ukraine, but of course it goes so much further than Ukraine.
It does indeed. And the momentum around this over the last couple of years has been quite extraordinary. And I mean, Ukraine's played a very important part in that by highlighting that the kinds of damage that happen during conflict to the environment are hugely important and often kind of, in a sense, hidden in plain sight behind the focus that is understandably placed on human casualties and damage to infrastructure. But of course, it is the environmental damage that stretches the furthest and lasts the longest and can last well beyond an actual conflict. But to do an update on the legislative progress, it has been quite remarkable. So since the definition came out, there have been a large number of proposals in different jurisdictions, some of which have not succeeded yet, some of which have been, are still in progress, and one or two of which have actually been adopted. So just to give you a brief list of those: Argentina, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Belgium, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, France, French Polynesia, Iceland, Italy, Kenya, Mexico, the Netherlands, Peru, Portugal, Scotland, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, Germany and the UK, as well as, of course, Ukraine. So there have been a lot of national jurisdictions where proposals have been put forward and where this discussion is continuing. And there are more where it hasn't, sort of gone as far as that, but is under discussion. And what we've also seen over the last few years is a really important development within the EU. So there's been a directive adopted last year, actually, called the Directive on the Protection of the Environment through Criminal Law. And that was a revision of a 2008 directive. And the new version of that directive, which has been adopted and which European countries must harmonise with over the next but by summer of next year, it includes what they're calling a qualified offence, which will address conduct comparable to ecocide. Now, that doesn't cover every potential conduct comparable to ecocide, but it does it across a range of around 20 crimes that are covered by that directive. So it's a very strong foundational step in the right direction from the European Union. And that took several years of discussions going through different European committees, all of those kinds of things. And, on the sort of aspect of, connecting the dots and the sort of narrative around that and working with particular MEPs and NGOs, we were obviously in the thick of all of that. But that development really gave us a sort of a platform internationally in terms of the movement. And in fact, certain states that had been very much at the forefront of this discussion were then able to take bigger steps. And I'm thinking particularly of the Pacific Island nation of Vanuatu, which has been an extraordinary advocate and champion of ecocide law, as indeed it has of other legal initiatives to address climate and ecological crisis. They very successfully led 130 plus countries to request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which is the UN court, also based in The Hague, to actually find out what are the legal obligations of states under existing law with regard to climate. And that request was passed by consensus, the first time such a request has ever passed in that way in the UN. And that's now had its hearings at the International Court of Justice, and that advisory opinion will be coming out soon. But it was also Vanuatu which was the first country to bring up the topic in the ICC, the International Criminal Court's annual assembly. And last year, alongside sister Pacific nations, Fiji and Samoa, became the first country to propose an amendment to the Rome Statute to actually include ecocide as a fifth crime. So that's something that we've been advocating for, that Yuliia and many others have been advocating for over recent years, but it's actually now on the diplomatic table, actually for the first time. And that is a massive development. Not only that, but shortly afterwards, so the proposal was made in September, and in October, there was a big UN conference in Colombia on biodiversity, as most of your audience will be aware. And during that conference, the Democratic Republic of Congo publicly and strongly expressed its support also for this crime at the level of the International Criminal Court. Of course, as a leading African state, that has really opened up the conversation across Africa as well. And I'll just finish by saying that what's fascinating here, perhaps not surprising, but it always, makes me feel a huge amount of admiration for these countries, is in all of these cases, we are looking at victim states. So in the Pacific, Vanuatu, Fiji, Samoa, they're at the front line of climate damage and of the environmental impacts associated with that. Ukraine is absolutely on the front line, literally, of environmental damage in wartime. And for the Democratic Republic of Congo, I mean, now they also have conflict issues in that country, but when they joined this conversation, it was very much from the perspective of biodiversity and being one of the biggest rainforest countries in the world and having ecosystems and whole areas of natural richness that that are constantly under threat. So I think what we're seeing is those countries that really understand what ecocide means are the ones that are leading this, and others are kind of coming along in their wake.
Brilliant. Well, Jojo, thank you very much. You've painted a picture there that, right around the world, there's enormous momentum behind this now, and many countries leading the way. But here in the UK, perhaps less so on that. And so I'll come to Debbie Tann, Chief Executive of Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. I want to sort of come to you in a moment, Debbie, just about perhaps what the difference that having a crime of ecocide here in the UK would make. But first of all, tell us, just your chance to tell us about the beauty of Hampshire and Isle of Wight. It is a gorgeous bit of England, and just talk to us about the nature there that you're looking after with your team.
Thanks, Craig, and just brilliant to hear all the contributions so far, and it's a fascinating subject. So, you know, Hampshire is in the south of England. We've got the Isle of Wight, which is beautiful. The Isle of Wight is actually a biosphere reserve. It's one of only 7 in the UK, so it's incredibly important for all of its nature, incredible marine habitats, really unique wildlife that you don't find anywhere else. Hampshire has the New Forest, the South Downs. We've got these brilliant chalk streams, which are globally important. We've got 85% of the world's chalk streams, and most of those are in southern Britain. So we've got some really incredible habitats here, you know, really unique things that are very, very special, not just locally and nationally, but globally. So we're super lucky to have all of that. But of course, being in the southeast of England, we have huge pressures on our natural resources. And, you know, I very much resonate with what Jonathon was saying, that our natural resources are very much seen as something which either is exploited to support the economy, or it's for tourism, or there's some other kind of material value to that. You know, we've got less water in southern Britain than, you know, desert nations. We're running out of water. Our coastline is suffering from coastal change. We've got really high levels of pollution, not only air pollution, but also water pollution, nutrient overloads. So we've got real pressures on these incredible habitats that, you know, they're still in okay condition, but then they won't be for long, and they're sort of hanging on really by a thread. But what is really quite upsetting, I suppose, in many ways, is that because we've lost that nature connection, most people don't know. They don't realise, you know, it still looks pretty. You can still look across and have a beautiful view. You've got the hills, you've got the coastline. Looks great, but it's dead. You know, some of our rivers are dead. You know, there's very little life in our beautiful landscapes. And so that ecosystem is not functioning as it should. And as a consequence, you know, we are seeing biodiversity declines. We're seeing huge amounts of flooding. You know, we've got air temperatures out of control in urban areas. We've got fires on our heaths. And so we can see our ecosystems breaking down in front of our very eyes. And yet most people can't see it. And as an ecologist, sadly, you know, it's actually quite hard for us deep green ecologists to sort of really have a great time when we go to the countryside, because sadly we can just see what's wrong. And we know what's possible because we're doing things like rewilding, we're restoring habitats. And I can tell you, 3, 4, 5 years in, wildlife will come back. You know, nature does have an incredible resilience here. We know it can regenerate. We just need to stop exploiting it and actually let it recover. So we know through our restoration work we can bring wildlife back, and we've shown it time and time again. But, you know, we are up against a global economic system that frankly isn't giving nature a chance. And, you know, as Jonathon said, nature is either a triviality, you know, a sort of fluffy hedgehog that, you know, it might be just a nice thing to look at, or it's a luxury we can't afford. You know, we can't go green until we're in the black. That's another phrase you hear from politicians. We need to fix the economy first and then we'll sort out nature. Or it's a commodity to exploit, you know, and it's very rare that you will get that conversation with politicians or business people that truly understand the intrinsic value of nature for all of our lives. And this is why I'm just so excited to really support the ecosystem movement. And I met Sue Miller at the IUCN conference in Bruges last year. And this is what, you know, I knew all about it because I've been following it for years, but just got really excited about the progress that had been made in the last few years. And I feel that there's just not enough jeopardy out there, you know, as we've got lots of environmental rules, but they're quite administrative, and you can break environmental rules and pay a fine. And most businesses will actually include that fine in their business plans. You know, I've seen it. I've been to board meetings of corporations and they put it in their contingency budgets because they're probably going to at some point break an environmental rule, and then they just pay the fine and move on. or you might have to make good. You know, if you destroy something, or you can just plant another tree, or you can create something somewhere else, and that's perfectly fine, and you can move on. And so I feel like this whole ecosystem movement really raises that jeopardy, and it changes the conversation. And what I also particularly like about Ecocide is that you don't have to show a direct impact on humans, unlike most other laws. It stands on its own as just a moral, something that's morally wrong. And I really love that about this, because it's should be a moral taboo. You know, I totally agree with that question earlier. Why should we feel that it's okay to destroy the very thing that keeps us alive? So sorry, I've said much more than you asked me to say.
No, it's all good, Debbie.
But, you know, it's just so relevant, I think, to everybody, every citizen of the globe. This is relevant in my view.
Yeah. Give me an example of, like, in Hampshire, you know, to take that definition of ecocide that Jojo was telling us earlier, where it talks about severe or widespread or long-term damage to the environment. What would you say, what's doing that in Hampshire at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one. And, you know, whether ecocide law per se would work in this case, but a lot of the issues we find are, you know, things like diffuse pollution over many decades, many different causes, over long periods of time. And that's quite difficult, I think, with a law like this. However, I do think, you know, it does raise the jeopardy, and it does force the conversation to happen, and questions to be asked, which is really important, because there's an awful lot of pointing the blame. You know, whose fault is it? You know, we have really severe nutrient pollution issues in England, and the water companies will say, well, we're only responsible for 4% of it, and the agriculture is responsible for X%, and development's responsible for X%. And there's an awful lot of back and forth and conversation about whose fault it is and who should pay. And all the while, over decades and decades and decades, who loses? Nature. And eventually you get to a point where there's some sort of mitigation, and unfortunately, we play that game. We have to. It's, you know, unfortunately, it's the only game in town at the moment. But I would much rather see just this moral imperative to look after the environment just completely raised, and be something that all businesses and all sectors really have to take into account properly, because they really don't at the moment. And I think the last thing I wanted to say was really around this focus on corporations and sectors rather than citizens, because that's something else that's really played out, isn't it, over the last few decades. Is, you know, it feels like there's a lot of blame or a lot of responsibility put on citizens. Make sure you recycle, make sure you do this, you do that, you know, buy secondhand clothes, don't eat this, don't fly, don't travel. And it's all on us as citizens. And that's not right. You know, most people are suffering. A lot of young people are suffering from eco-anxiety, and all of, you know, we see this a lot, and they're feeling this huge responsibility when it's not their fault. So I really, again, feel, you know, this ecocide conversation can start to bring it back to the boardrooms, back to politicians, to make the right decisions and start to really raise that jeopardy for environmental destruction.
Well, Debbie Tann, Chief Executive of Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, thank you very much for kicking us off there. We're now definitely going into probably the Q&A proper, and we've had loads and loads of questions come in, first of all, even before we started today, but many more come in during this broadcast as well. I want to pick up actually on the point that Debbie was referring to there about that, you know, often, I suppose I'm coming straight back to you, Jojo, on this quickly. Often, sometimes a lot of harm to the environment is what might be called by diffuse pollution. Debbie was giving an example there of nutrient pollution, say from fertilizers and so on, which Debbie has shown me down in the Isle of Wight in the Solent, you know, really quite devastating impact on marine wildlife and on the shore of the Solent and so on. But we've also had a question, say, from Anthony Lamb, has said, surely the proliferation of nanoplastic particles throughout the environment is a possible ecocide. Who is responsible and who could be held to account? What about this, Jojo? I mean, like in these cases of diffuse pollution, you know, is it the nutrient pollution? Is it trying to bring a crime of ecocide against every farmer and every water company? Nanoplastics, is it against all of us that are causing it? What's the answer?
the simple answer is no, in the sense that because with criminal law, you're looking at a clear causation, as in a single act leading to a lot of harm. So those kind of cumulative and diffuse cases are not the kind of thing that Ecocide can best address. What the sort of thing that you'd be looking at, I suppose, I'm trying to think of some sort of UK examples that might be relevant in this case. So, for example, massive sewage pollution of an entire river system, for example, because, it has to be something really pretty big scale to be considered ecocide and be able to be traced back to an action or a failure to act, if you like. So, I mean, I can't guarantee that would necessarily cover, but one of the best ways to think about this is what kinds of disasters or really severe environmental harms could have been averted or avoided had this been in place, because what that really taps into is the power of having a serious crime in place also as a deterrent. So, I mean, for example, let's think about HS2 in the UK, which was effectively planned to go through 100+ ancient, irreplaceable, effectively, woodlands. I mean, when you've got hundreds and hundreds of years of old growth forest or woodland, it's not like you can suddenly plant another tree and it's going to replace that ecosystem. It doesn't work like that. But you can imagine that the planning and the sort of development of a project like that would have looked very different, in the sense that it might not be that it wouldn't have happened. It may be that we desperately need a high-speed railway line, who knows, but it wouldn't have gone that route. There was actually somebody that spent some time looking at how that line could have gone without cutting through all of those ancient woodlands. And there were possibilities for that. Now, if ecocide law had been in place, you can bet your bottom dollar they would have looked at that, because they would have been then actually confronted with the possibility that, damaging over 100 ancient woodlands could constitute an ecocide. So you're looking at those kinds of situations, like sort of, where you're affecting quite seriously how people approach things. And to take a couple of more international examples, I mean, classic one that springs to mind is the Texaco Chevron case in Ecuador, where there were quite, sort of effectively sort of deliberately negligent decisions made, which led to huge extent of toxic pollution across ecosystems that also damaged huge numbers of local and indigenous lives. And you can, again, if had a crime been in place that could have covered that, those, that the behavior would have been probably very different. And that is the kind of thing that we're looking at. We're looking at also that, in that way, the kind of the deterrent function, but also the kind of expressive function, because, and I think this is where Debbie was really spot on when she was talking about a taboo. I think it was Debbie that was mentioning that, we need to have a taboo around severe harm to nature that is not currently there. I mean, you're not going to go to a government and say, can I have a license to kill 500 people for my new infrastructure project? It's literally not going to cross your mind. It's criminal, it's criminally insane. And of course, it's profoundly taboo in our culture to be killing people for a business purpose. But we don't have that same recoil when it comes to nature. And of course, we have to look at the proportion. It's all about proportion here, because of course you can't build a house without at least killing a few insects. I mean, humanity exists in relationship with nature. We cannot preserve absolutely everything in nature, or we wouldn't be here. But what we must do is draw a line where things become dangerous, where they become unacceptable, where they become actually detrimental long-term to how we exist and how the natural world that supports us exists.
So Jojo, if I take it right, in terms of this diffuse kind of pollution question, if you could point to a single entity that is causing it over a large area, so say if it was pesticide harm caused by continued use of particular pesticides, it wouldn't be an action against individual farmers, but it might potentially be against the company making the pesticide if over a long period of time they're not taking the action required. Could it be like that?
I think that if you could identify a point where a decision is being taken,
right,
to either to allow or encourage or produce, I mean, it's a bit difficult to pin exactly until
sure,
the law's in place and can be used. But I'm with you in the sense that it's more likely the higher the further upstream you go,
yeah,
more likely you are to be in the territory of what could be potentially come under, what could potentially come under this law. And that's really, really important, and speaks to what Debbie was talking about the unfairness of of putting the blame on ordinary people and their ordinary usage of something, when actually the decisions that really cause the harm are made at the highest level.
Yeah.
Craig, can I just add one quick rider on that, which is the recklessness bit that has been referred to before. So a lot will depend on the evidence base for the damage done. So with neonicotinoids, for instance, the evidence base about what will happen to critical parts of different ecosystems, particular impact on our pollinators, is astonishingly strong. And yet we still see huge volumes of these highly toxic chemicals at use in our environment. Now, those who manufacture those chemicals, they know perfectly well what the impact will be. Now, if there isn't a causal trail there back to an ecocidal decision by that manufacturer, I better not mention it in case I end up facing a horrendous legal process, then Ecocide doesn't mean anything, because what those chemical companies are doing now is emphatically ecocidal.
Yeah. Yuliia, I'd love to ask, and actually I should say, Jojo, John Broad will be very pleased that you mentioned HS2, because his comment was ecocide sounds like the description of most of the root of HS2. So, but Yuliia, let me come to you. What have you found in Ukraine? What have you been some of the really what have been the difficulties? How have you found, the issues around implementation of this? What has been the particular sort of areas to focus on to get the implementation right, and indeed also seeking the evidence, robust evidence base?
Craig, thank you for your question now, because when we create this special group, because the committee of law enforcement say about they change the criminal code and to adopt the new version of criminal code. Now, after the ratification of the Rome Statute and according to our EU negotiation process, we stopped this. But really, to tell the truth, we had a big and very difficult discussion on this article. But to tell the truth, first of all, we think about the decriminalization of the court in this proceeding when we something change of article criminal court, and it's really for us law enforcement to tell the truth, because we have to suspicious under this article, and every time when we say about these crimes and proceeding after in wartime, very difficult to from the prosecutor office to include to the special system. For example, in Ukraine, create the Ministry of Environmental creates this special electronic system which named the environmental security, and in order to include all the information when, for example, every representative from Ukraine say what has happened, to give the information about this case, and the special office of ministry can analyze the situation and involve the national police, involve this office general prosecutor, and involve this this case. So, and law enforcement, decriminalization, and maybe very important to have all facts in order to include, because more difficult to have according to the international tribunals, because we have involved in this process international experts. So, and I think that's for now, really we have this special system, and now understanding, for example, we have cases with dead dolphins on Black Sea. And for this, we have scientists with the prosecutors and with ministry. And we, for example, invite the scientists from Danish Research Center in order to have more facts, which give a possibility to recognize this crime.
Yuliia, thank you very much. We had another question coming from Glenn Channel. Should nature have legal rights? Debbie, down in the south, not in Hampshire, I don't think, but in Sussex, your neighbouring county, a local council has tried to recognise the rights for the local river. Hard to do that in English law at the moment, but then they nonetheless passed a motion to try and advance that. And of course, in there are countries in Belize, Canada, New Zealand, and so on, where they have actually recognised rights for rivers in law as well. It's interesting just to talk a little bit whether this question about whether nature should have legal rights, is it the same or different from a kind of a crime of ecocide? I mean, it sort of feels like it's related, but it's not quite the same thing. But Debbie, tell us a little bit more about, you know, the state of rivers down in Hampshire and in Sussex, and what's led to, you know, the council in Sussex declaring this.
Well, I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. And I think, you know, people really care about their rivers. And there's been this huge kind of uprising of, frankly, disgust and dismay about the level of pollution in our rivers. And there has been a huge growth in you know, campaigning and that sort of thing. And actually, we in Hampshire also have a rights of the river motion being looked at by one of our councils as well, which is really fantastic, building on the work done in Sussex. And we are seeing this real interest in the rights, the intrinsic rights of nature. And we hope the rights of the river motion will go through in our North Hampshire local authority, because they're actually really, really concerned about the status of one of their chalk streams, which does not have currently any protection. And incidentally, we are campaigning really hard to get chalk streams properly legally protected, all of them. Most people may not, I don't know if people will appreciate, but we have SSSI and other legislation like SACs and things, but they're only representative designation, so you only, you know, pick a few of them to have protections, and that leaves the rest completely unprotected, and frankly they're just as important and just as good as the protected ones. So our chalk streams campaign that we've been running for many years has started to really gain momentum recently, and we have got some amendments at the moment going into the new planning and infrastructure bill to try and get chalk streams properly protected in planning, which will hopefully prevent the worst types of development related impacts on rivers, because of course a river isn't just the channel, it's all of the land around it, and so everything that happens on the land around the river will hugely impact the ecological quality of that river. So there's a lot of interest in water and rivers, and a growing interest in rights of the river motions, which we hope we'll have one soon as well in Hampshire.
Thank you, Debbie. This is absolutely a topic of, I think I can already say, a brilliant book. I'm halfway through it. The new book by Robert McFarland, Is a River Alive? It's coming out in 2-3 weeks' time, I think. I'm currently reading it. I've got an advance copy to read it, to do a review for one of our national newspapers, and I'm about halfway through, and I'm loving it so far, I can tell you. Jojo, just quickly on this, this whole movement also about rights for rivers, legal personhood for nature, nature having legal rights, where do you see that fitting alongside ecocide? Is it similar? Is it different? Is it complementary, or something else?
It's definitely complementary. I mean, we sort of see the rights sphere as being kind of the other side of the coin, if you like. You know, the two things complement each other. And there are actually, in fact, I think there are 30+ jurisdictions around the world where rights have been given, or legal personhood has been given to particular landscape features. So it's actually quite a sort of it's quite an advanced movement around the world. But it is different, and the relationship, I suppose, I mean, the easiest way to describe it is to think about, I mean, our basic human right is the right to life. But what protects that right is the fact that taking away that life is a crime. You know, if you can have a human right to life, but if murder isn't a crime, your right to life has limited sort of viability. And so it actually shows how important it is to have the sort of criminal counterpart to the right sphere, because criminal law is all about protection. I mean, ultimately, you know, murder is a crime to stop people killing each other. You know, I mean, punishing murderers is just how that works. You know, it's about preventing and deterring things that are unacceptable, you know, by creating the repercussions. And that's what sort of ecocide law does in relation to the rights of nature movement, in relation to, you know, legal personhood for nature, but also in relation to human rights. I mean, for example, there is the recently acknowledged human right to a clean and safe environment that's been acknowledged by the UN. And that obviously is very kind of sits in a very complementary relationship with ecocide law. But we would say that the rights of nature movement is ultimately more radical and, you know, more of a fundamental shift in the legal system, if you like, than ecocide law, in the sense that adding a crime to an existing list of crimes is a relatively straightforward thing to do and doesn't require something else to be put in place first. I mean, if you think about it, you know, we've had crimes against people and property for centuries, but human rights is a relatively new discourse, couple of 100 years. So yeah, the two work in parallel, if you like, but we would definitely say that ecocide law would help in the general direction of moving the legal system towards a more broader, more system-wide acknowledgement of nature and its rights.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's curious, isn't it, Jonathon, this whole kind of discourse, because you have, there will be some people that say, oh, you can't possibly give legal rights to a river. What a load of old nonsense. I think the same kind of people that wouldn't question for a minute you can give legal rights to corporations, for example. And it is interesting that there are many more established legal rights for corporations and the abilities for corporations as legal entities to sue and be sued and all of those kind of things, and to pass on wealth and all of that stuff in a way that actually we haven't recognized that in nature, certainly not in the Western world.
Yeah, the test of all of this is what the attribution of a personhood or a legal status to any particular part of the natural world, what that means in practical terms, in implementation. So I'm half a New Zealander. I've spent a lot of time in New Zealand. New Zealand was the first country to accord rights to the Whanganui River, which is an astonishingly important ecosystem in New Zealand. Very strong roots for the iwi, for the Maori people in New Zealand. But the story now is, what happens if the farmers and the businesses along the Whanganui River do not temper their behavior, do not mitigate their behavior, do not do anything? And you then have to come back to what kind of legal redress would you still require? Because, of course, the river can't bring its own case. The iwi, the Maori people, will be the plaintiffs for the river. And that is now a very live issue in New Zealand politics, where we've now got a right-wing government in New Zealand, which is pushing back against anything to do with the idea of iwi, of the Maori cultural significance for New Zealand as a whole, including pushing back on this personhood or the legal status for the Whanganui River. So I'm a huge supporter of this movement as well, legal rights for nature, just as I am for ecocide. But eventually we're up against massively powerful, brutal forces of established incumbency in politics and business who've learnt how to either crush dissent and opposition or work their way around it or game it or whatever. And we are still, in my opinion, innocents abroad in this whole area. We still don't understand the true nature of power in this brutal 21st century version of capitalism. We're getting our head around it eventually, Craig, but wow, it's quite a learning curve for people to understand it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jonathon. Well, look, I'm going to come on to the next question from Tanya Carey. And it comes really to the point of what we might call remedies. Tanya said, well, she made a comment rather than a question, but she said it would be good to push the ecocide criminals into fixing the problems they caused. It's currently done by charities and volunteers. Don't me down it, Debbie, who often can't afford to fix the damage. So what about that? What about remedies, Jojo? What have you been thinking about that? How would you punish? How do you punish ecocide, and actually what would be the remedies?
Well, in terms of sentencing, that emerges differently in different jurisdictions. So, for example, one of the things that comes up is what they call the minimum maximum sentence for a crime, and that can vary depending on the jurisdiction. So, I think with the European directive, the recommendation is a certain number of years as a minimum maximum sentence, but then they also include, for example, the corporate a response to corporations that are committing ecocide that is like a significant percentage of turnover, which is really quite serious and therefore quite deterrent, for example. But it will vary according to the penal codes in different jurisdictions. However, there is scope for creating things like restoration orders or those kinds of things as part of a sentencing structure, and again, those will exactly how that will play out in different jurisdictions. It won't be universal. That won't be universal across the world, but it is an aspect that, for example, the International Criminal Court has engaged with in the past in terms of reparation or reparation to victims or restoration. So it's certainly an option that's potentially there. I would, however, also come back to the fact that the ultimate aim, certainly during peacetime, of ecocide law is to prevent damage in the first place. If you get to the stage where an ecosystem has already been destroyed, yes, of course you want to try and restore it, but the whole idea of this is to shift that whole mentality so that people actually recoil from creating that level of damage in the first place.
Yeah, of course. And Debbie and Yuliia, to both of you, really very different contexts, but just very quickly, what would you see as some of the remedies? What would you see as some of the punishments you'd like to see for ecocide in your particular parts of the world? Let's start with you, Yuliia, first.
Yeah, yes, we are really, as I say about the problem in our country, because we hurry really according to our criminal court is the higher responsibility and punished for the 8 years responsible for this crime. But really, we haven't the results for this article and in peacetime when before the war, because really we have a lot of cooperation, as you know. This is article, and this is not the same, but this article is present in such countries as Moldova, Georgia, also Armenia, and in Russia as well. So, and this is a problem that now we are trying to implementation. It's not problem for us because it's very big responsibility, and we necessarily think how the change. As I said before about the decriminalization, because we have open 14 precedent. And for us, it's very responsible how we will be the change our legislation according to the EU standards and according to the, as I said, Jojo, before, directive which adopted last year in European Parliament. And this is really a very, very big for us question, because now we are continue this cooperation. But really, I think we are absolutely support initiative. The definition, which the process will be absolutely continuing with the directive. But as I say, we have the punish 8 years, and for us, really, we want the results because open precedent, and for us necessary to continue this. For us, it's more difficult, you understand, because it's wartime, and necessary according to the new procedure, not one step, it's maybe more than 5 steps in order to come to this.
Yeah, thank you, Yuliia. And Debbie, in the very different context of Hampshire, but all the same, I'm going to ask you, Hampshire and Isle of Wight, what would you see as potentially the remedies here?
I mean, it's an interesting one, and I'll just take a little quick step back, if I may. That we already have principles in place, the precautionary principle, and something I read about ecosystem law is that this kind of almost polices the precautionary principle, or certainly holds it out there as a really important principle, as you were saying, Jojo, around deterrence and prevention. So we do have a precautionary principle. We also have, you know, a mitigation hierarchy, and we have a lot of things in place. I mean, I won't get into it now, but some of these are actually threatened at the moment by certain proposals. And we also have something called irreplaceable habitats. We also have something called biodiversity net gain. We also have, you know, various mitigation schemes that people can do. And, you know, those are fine, but I'm very worried that we have got ourselves into a situation where it's really easy to just pay into a fund or pay for biodiversity net gain or pay for mitigation. And as I was saying earlier, that's a really easy way out. Now, that's not to say nature can't be restored, and I talked a little bit about that earlier, and we can do that. But some habitats are irreplaceable. And at what point, you know, is mitigation's just not enough? I mean, we'll do it because we kind of have to, and we'll do it well, and we'll really try hard to put back more than is taken. But, you know, if it worked, we wouldn't have a biodiversity crisis. So, you know, there are tools we can use, but they need to be much more effective. So things like biodiversity net gain is a start, but it you know, it needs to be 50%, 100%, not just 10%, because that really only just about covers your losses. So there are some mechanisms in place. They need to be improved, but there also needs to be better deterrence, much more application of the precautionary principle, and much more application of the mitigation hierarchy. It should be possible to avoid the worst damage. In Britain, we only have, what, 5%, 6%, 8% at a push of our landscape that's good for nature. That leaves an awful lot of other land. So it should be possible to avoid the most important places for nature. So why those are still sort of, you know, on the cards, on the table, as it were, for potential development impacts is you know, a real mystery to me. But, you know, we continue to push in this area, and we can deliver really high quality mitigation if necessary. But the first step has always got to be avoid.
Yeah. So you talked about the mitigation hierarchy there, very important, very relevant right now, because we believe it's very much under threat in the new planning and infrastructure bill that is currently going through Parliament. Mitigation hierarchy, very simply, is to absolutely do everything you can avoid to avoid harm to nature in the first place, particularly the most sort of irreplaceable nature like ancient woodlands, chalk streams, and so on, and then obviously reduce the harm. If you really can't do that in some circuit or in habitats where reducing the harm might still lead that you still have decent nature, and then only ever consider kind of offsetting or biodiversity net gain where actually that can still lead to an overall improvement for nature. Sam Battler would have been very pleased that you mentioned the precautionary principle, Debbie, because he asked a question about implementing the precautionary principle before. Why not have stronger enforcement of that before introducing products and projects, and said that would stop neonicotinoids and other high toxic chemicals at source. Quite right, Sam. In just the last few minutes, I want to come back, Jojo, to, you know, what's an exciting development, I think, later this year. Debbie mentioned the IUCN earlier, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or the World Conservation Union. We're very proud that the Wildlife Trust was one of the 5 founding members of IUCN back in the 1940s and 1950s, and it's now an extraordinary network of conservation organisations and governments, something like 1,300 conservation organisations and governments around the world working together to try and find a way forward on restoring and protecting nature. It's best known perhaps for its the red lists that it produces and so on. But in autumn this year, there is a World Conservation Congress of IUCN, and this only happens once every 4 years. And you're bringing a resolution to that Congress and trying to get all the governments and all the organisations to support the resolution. I'm very proud to say that the Wildlife Trust are one of the co-sponsors of this, Jojo. Tell us what the resolution says and what it calls on IUCN members to do.
Okay, I actually don't have it in front of me right this second.
Very briefly.
But effectively, it is about recognising ecocide to protect nature, and it acknowledges the various sort of relevant resolutions in the past from the IUCN. I'm delighted to hear that the Wildlife Trust was one of the original sort of founding members, if you like. I hadn't realised that. That's amazing. It is a unique organisation in the sense that it has such a huge membership, but the fact that it has a mixture of NGO and governmental members members is very unusual. And we've got in terms of this motion, which encourages IUCN to recommend the recognition of ecocide, recognition of ecocide as a serious crime, and encourage member states to move forward with it and support it also at the international level, is really important. And it's one of those situations where, because that resolution has been, or that motion has been accepted into the system and will be discussed at the Congress later this year, it means that all of those governments that are members of, or whose environmental departments are members of the IUCN, will be obliged to read through that resolution. So, and of course, so will all the hundreds of NGO members, and that is a phenomenal opportunity in and of itself to bring the developments and the discussion around ecocide law to all of those people. And we have a lot of support from various different organizations, including Wildlife Trust, but also from, we've got a state co-sponsor in Vanuatu, and we've got other state supporters, for example, Democratic Republic of Congo and others. And over the next few months, we're going to be sort of gathering momentum around this resolution, because because of that sort of unique makeup of IUCN, it will be actually interesting for and influential for government players as well. So yeah, very exciting.
Great. Well, Jojo, thank you very much. I really look forward to working with you at that World Conservation Congress, and for us to try and drum up as much support as possible for what I think is a really important resolution. Well, we're in the last few minutes, last minute or two of this now, so I'm going to come to each of you just to give a final conclusion. And really, I'm going to start with you, Yuliia, if I can. Just in a sentence or two, Ecocide, its time has come, but why? Why do you think it's so important right now?
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Really, when we war start, every hour Ukrainians say that environment is a silent witness and victim of this war. But really, for this period of our fighting, I want to frankly say that the environment is no longer the silent victim, because it speaks with our voices on all international arena, the voices of our researchers, of our representative of civil society, the voices of our partners. And we were really very happy to cooperate with the Jojo and Stop Ecocide International, because it gives us to create the platform of really international cooperation, and to invite all general prosecutors to help us in these issues. And I think that it's very important to continue work between our parliamentarians, to cooperate with government, to cooperate together with the non-governmental organization. This is not just a legal matter, but also it's a political and economic choice of every of us. Thank you.
Yuliia, I love that. Thank you so much. What a really moving way to finish. Thank you very much. Jonathon, Ecocide, why now?
At one level, that's extremely obvious because of the damage that's been done historically, and because of the damage which will go on being done into the future until we change this particular model of progress, as I've been talking about it. This is just-in-time emergency response to a collapsing world, collapsing nature. And although more people are focused on the climate emergency than they are on the nature emergency, trust me, these two things move pretty much in tandem together. And the more people who can see it and understand the materiality of it, the better it is. So Ecocide is hugely important in terms of bringing it home to people that this is absolutely of the moment.
Thank you, Jonathon. Debbie, why now, and why in the UK in particular?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think this is, it's not the only tool we have in the toolbox, but for me, it's so important to just change the language, change the sense of jeopardy, and create that moral taboo, and just allow these conversations to happen across the world. And in the UK, we have this growth mantra. We have this belief that, unfettered continuing economic growth is going to somehow save us. And, we've got to change that model. We've got to look at completely different economic models that value prosperity, not just growth. models that tackle things like inequality. I mean, we haven't really talked much about inequality, but that's hugely relevant to this discussion. It's the poorest in society that suffer from air pollution and lack of green space and all of these things. So they are interlinked, and there are pockets of discussions going on. We've got a fabulous community on the Isle of Wight, actually, where we're having some really live conversations about creating a model there for a truly regenerative, circular, self-sustaining economy where we're regenerating nature and creating jobs and prosperity and tackling some of these big social questions of our time. And the ecosystem sits within all of that. And I hope that the 21st century humans will soon realize that our mission this century is to change that model of progress. And this is part of that conversation, and I really want to be part of doing whatever I can in my lifetime to change things for the better.
Brilliant, Debbie, thank you very much. And Jojo, final word to you at Stop Ecocide International. Why now?
Well, I think I've actually got 3 short things, hopefully, to say around that. One is that, although I completely understand why Jonathon just said what he did, this is a response to emergency, I would actually almost flip that and say that we're in the emergency because a law like this has not been in place. So in effect, it's a kind of a common sense missing piece that just should have always been there and will always be there. And why now is I sort of feel like criminal law and cultural consciousness have this sort of crossing point sometimes, where the awareness has to be enough within those who are at a sort of potentially at a legislative level, policy making level, for a law to be put through. And that level of awareness has not really been present until quite recently. But once that legislation is put in place, that then has a ripple effect out through the culture, so that even though the awareness, at a sort of mass level may not be there around ecocide law right now, it will become so by the creation of the crime, because we associate what's okay and what's not morally, in terms of behavior, with a crime. And the last thing would come back to what Jonathon was talking about our awareness of how connected we are to the earth and to nature. And also this sort of links back perhaps also to Yuliia, because I was giving a speech to the Ukrainian Research Institute in Harvard not that long ago, and I learned that there's a word in Ukrainian that means land, territory, mother and earth all at once. And it's a word that I don't know if I'm going to pronounce it right, zemlya, and so it also means home. And of course, if you can, and that actually made me really understand why it is that Ukrainians really get this law. Because actually, when you link all of those things together, mother, home, territory, earth, clearly it's wrong to destroy that. And I think that understanding is something that we very much hope the ecocide law movement will be bringing to the world at large through the medium of criminal law.
Brilliant, Jojo. Very moving way to close. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of you watching tonight, and for all your comments and questions that have been coming in. I'm sorry I haven't been able to get through all of them, but just to give actually the panel as much as anything a bit of a sense of this. Lovely comment from Miles Jolly saying, hello from Suffolk in the UK, and my answer is a resounding yes. Of course, ecocide should destroy nature be a crime. Absolutely. Beatrix Musker in Hove in East Sussex, very thought-provoking, thank you. Kelly Ludlow said, nature should definitely have rights and law. Without nature, there is no food. As humans, we should be working with nature, not against it, and certainly not destroying it. A lot of support out there, Jojo, tonight for ecocide to be a crime for sure. So thank you to all of you for your comments and questions coming tonight. And of course, huge thank you in particular to the wonderful panel we have here. Jojo Mehta, Chair of Stop Ecocide International, Yuliia Ovchynnykova, wonderful Member of Parliament in the Ukrainian Parliament. Thank you so much for joining us for Kyiv tonight. Debbie Tann, Chief Executive, Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, and Jonathon Porritt, Sustainability Campaign and author. Thank you all for taking time to join tonight and to inform this brilliant discussion. Our next Wildlife is on community food growing on the 28th of May. So look out for registration, which will open soon for that, and join again. And we'll be bringing you regular Wildlives right through 2025. We've got some more exciting ones planned, sometimes like this, just online, sometimes with live audiences in person as well. So make sure you keep an eye on our social media channels and look at your emails to register and to be part of them. But really, just closing tonight, I hope you've all agreed that this has been a very, very important discussion. You know, as I think Jonathon was saying, as all our panelists were saying tonight, you know, the mess we're in with the climate and nature crisis just shows that we cannot carry on the way we have been doing as humanity. And we've really broken down that relationship between humans and nature. You know, it's so extraordinary that, of course, the economy, of course, is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature. And yet the way the world is wired at the moment, we treat it as if nature is a wholly owned subsidiary of the economy. And then we wonder why things are going wrong. If we can't rewire the economy, if we can't rewire our relationship between humans and nature, then maybe we won't have another step of human progress. This is the defining question of the 21st century, I believe. And we've got to get it right, because there is only one planet for us to live on, despite what some rather strange billionaires might be saying. And actually, this is a rather beautiful planet to live on. So let's stay here and live here as if we mean to stay. From the Wildlife Trust for Wildlife, thank you and good night.